A gate supervisor at a private aviation terminal in Van Nuys, California, told a man in a plain gray jacket that he could not board the aircraft currently sitting on the apron. Not because he lacked clearance, not because the flight had been canceled, because the supervisor had decided, in the 14 seconds since the man had walked through the door, that he did not look like someone who belonged on a private aircraft. Old jacket, dark jeans, a worn leather duffel, the kind with metal buckles that had lost their finish. No assistant, no luggage tag. No one walking ahead of him to announce his arrival. He looked like someone who had come to the wrong terminal. He had not. He had come to the right terminal, on the right day, at the right time, because he was scheduled to fly the aircraft himself. He was the pilot. His name was on the registration. His signature was on the maintenance logs in the operations office 6 feet behind where the supervisor was standing. He said none of this. He stood at the counter with the duffel at his feet and looked at the supervisor with the patient expression of someone who has encountered obstacles before and has learned to let the obstacle run its course before deciding what to do about it. He said, "All right." He stepped aside. He sat down in one of the terminal chairs and took out his phone and made one call. Quiet and brief, with his back to the counter. 31 minutes later, the supervisor would understand everything. And the young gate agent named Sonia Torres, who had been standing 4 feet to the supervisor's left, watching with her lanyard twisted in both hands, would carry what she saw in those 31 minutes for the rest of her professional life. There is a private aviation terminal on Havenhurst Avenue in Van Nuys, California, called the AvCenterFBO. FBO stands for Fixed Base Operator, which is the industry term for a private terminal, a facility that handles general aviation and charter flights, refueling, hangar space, and the particular service standard expected by people who have decided that commercial flying is not the version of flying they want to do. The AvCenter terminal is a low building of glass and pale stone set back from the apron behind a sliding door that requires a keycard and a code. Inside, a lounge with cream leather chairs, a coffee and refreshment station that is restocked every 3 hours, a flight planning desk, and a counter for passenger services staffed by 2 people on most days and 3 during peak periods. Through the glass wall at the back of the lounge, the apron is visible, the flat expanse of concrete where aircraft park, where fuel trucks move in and out, where the specific business of private aviation takes place at a pace that is quieter and more deliberate than the commercial side of the airport. Van Nuys Airport is the busiest general aviation airport in the country. More than 200,000 aircraft operations a year take place here. Private jets, charter flights, flight training, cargo. It is a working airport in a way that is different from LAX 6 miles south, less spectacle, more function. The people who use it tend to know what they are doing, or they are in the process of learning, and the staff who work here have developed the specific competence of people who operate in close proximity to expensive machines and expensive clients, and cannot afford inattention. The AvCenter terminal had for 18 months managed the hangar and operational logistics for a Cessna Citation CJ4 registered to a production company called Hillside Pacific Films. The aircraft was used for location scouts, production logistics, and the occasional executive transport requirement. The production company's accounts were handled through a corporate credit facility that paid reliably and on time. The pilot listed on the aircraft's operational records was a man who held a commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating and a multi-engine endorsement, and had been flying since he was 23 years old. He had logged 4,812 hours. He arrived that morning at 7:44 in a dark green pickup truck, the kind of truck that has been used and not replaced, with a small dent above the rear wheel arch that had been there for a while and had not been addressed because it was a truck, and trucks did not require that level of concern. He was wearing a plain gray jacket, dark jeans, the worn leather duffel over one shoulder. He pushed through the glass door and walked to the counter. The supervisor at the counter was a man named Richard Voss. You need to understand something about Richard Voss before you understand what he said in those 14 seconds. He was 49 years old and had been in private aviation operations for 22 years, first at a regional FBO in Arizona, then at 2 larger facilities in Southern California, and for the past 4 years at the AvCenter terminal in Van Nuys. He was the senior passenger services supervisor, which meant he managed the counter staff, oversaw the client-facing operation, and was, in his own understanding, the primary guarantor of the AvCenter's service standard. He wore a dark navy blazer every day. He wore it the way a uniform is worn, not as clothing, but as a position. His desk had a leather blotter. His badge was polished. He had opinions about the correct way to address aircraft owners and their guests, and those opinions were detailed and consistently applied. He had grown up in Tucson, the son of a contractor who had built custom homes for people who could afford custom homes, and had spent 30 years doing so with the specific competence and specific invisibility of someone whose name did not appear on any of the things he built. His father had been good at his work. His father had also been, in every non-work context, treated as though the work was the whole of what he was. Richard Voss had decided, somewhere in his 20s, that he was going to be on a different side of that equation. He had cultivated the presentation of a man who belonged in rooms with expensive things. He had learned the vocabulary of private aviation, the aircraft types, the avionics, the regulatory language, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge was a form of admission. He was, in his professional capacity, thorough, organized, and reliable. He was also in the specific way of people who have constructed a presentation with great care, highly sensitive to the presence of anyone who did not appear to have done the same. The man in the gray jacket had not done the same. He had come through the door without announcing himself, without the particular quality of arrival that Richard had come to associate with the clients of this terminal, the quick visual survey of the space, the expectation of being seen and addressed, the luggage that had the right labels. The man in the gray jacket had walked in the way someone walks when they are going somewhere they have been many times and are not thinking about how they appear in the process. This, to Richard, was a form of information. He had processed it in 14 seconds and arrived at a conclusion. The conclusion was wrong. He had not checked the operational schedule before he arrived at the conclusion, because the schedule was a document on a screen 3 feet to his right, and consulting it would have required him to revise what he had already decided. And revising a decision requires acknowledging that the decision was premature. And that was not a sequence Richard Voss found easy. There was a specific incident, 2 years earlier, that had made this sequence even less easy than it had always been. A man had arrived at the terminal in a very expensive car, with luggage that had the right labels, and Richard had greeted him with full service: the coffee, the pre-boarding assistance, the walk to the aircraft. The man had turned out to have no booking. He had been at the wrong terminal. He had been gracious about it. Richard had not been gracious about the fact that he had misread the situation so completely, had been so thoroughly led by the presentation that he had not verified anything at all. He had resolved, afterward, to be more rigorous. The rigor had calcified, without his noticing, into something slightly different: the conviction that presentation was a reliable signal, and that anything that didn't match the expected presentation was probably in the wrong place. He looked at the man in the gray jacket. "Can I help you?" he said. He said it in the tone that means, "I will determine whether I can help you once you explain what you are doing here." The terminal at 744 was quiet. One client, a woman in her 50s, reading, waiting for a crew member, sat in the far corner of the lounge. Sonia Torres was at the counter to Richard's left, processing a fuel receipt. The operations door behind the counter was ajar, and through it the sound of the apron was faintly audible. A turbine, somewhere in the distance. The mechanical background of a working airport. The man set his duffel on the floor and looked at Richard. "I'm here for the citation," he said. N4482H, 7:50 departure. Richard looked at him. He did not look at the schedule. "Do you have your booking confirmation?" "It's in the operational log. I'm the pilot." "The pilot?" "Yes." Richard looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard something that requires consideration. "The pilot for this aircraft is listed as..." He turned to the screen. He looked at the operational log. He was very still for a moment. "Can I see your certificate?" he said. His voice had not changed. It was still the voice of a man managing a situation. The man reached into the inside pocket of the gray jacket and produced a folded card. He placed it on the counter. Richard picked it up. He looked at it. He looked at the name. He looked at the man. He put the card down. "I'm going to need to verify this with the operations manager," he said. "Ted's in the hangar," the man said. "Bay 3. A pause. "I'm aware of where the operations manager is," Richard said. "I'm going to need you to wait while I confirm." The man looked at him. His expression did not change. No irritation, no recognition that the situation was extraordinary. Just the patient attention of someone watching a process run. "All right," he said. He picked up the duffel. He walked to the cream leather chairs and sat down. He took out his phone. He made one call. Brief, back-turned slightly. Sonia Torres had set down the fuel receipt. She had seen the certificate. She had read the name on it. She had watched Richard's face in the moment he read it, and she had watched Richard put the certificate down and say he needed to verify. She looked at the certificate on the counter. She looked at Richard. "Richard," she said. "Quietly. I'm handling it," Richard said. He was already moving toward the operations door. Sonia looked at the man in the cream chair. He was looking at his phone with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Present, unhurried, in no particular hurry about the fact that he was being asked to wait in a terminal he had used dozens of times while someone verified that he was who his certificate said he was. She looked at the certificate. She picked it up. She read it again. She set it back down. She looked at the operations door. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. 7:49. The flight was scheduled for departure at 7:50. Ted Nakamura had been the operations manager at the Av Center terminal for 11 years. He was 56 years old, compact, and had the specific economy of movement of someone who had spent decades working around aircraft. The careful precision of a man who knew that inattention around machines had consequences. He came through the operations door at 7:52. He was wiping his hands on a shop cloth. He looked at Sonia. He looked at the man in the cream chair. He looked at Richard, who was walking behind him. He said, "Keanu." The man in the cream chair looked up. "Ted," he said. He stood. Ted Nakamura crossed the terminal in 8 steps and shook his hand with the particular warmth of someone who has been managing logistics for a person for 18 months and has developed, in that time, a professional relationship with a human dimension to it. "I'm sorry about this," Ted said. "The operational log should have been. This shouldn't have happened." "It's fine," Keanu said. "It is not fine," Ted said. He said it without heat, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who had run a precise operation for 11 years and knew the difference between a systems error and a judgment error, and which one this was. He turned around. Richard Voss was standing at the counter with his hands flat on the leather blotter. The pilot certificate was on the counter, Ted said. The name on the operational log matches the name on the certificate. What required verification? Richard said nothing for a moment. Standard procedure, he said. When there's any ambiguity, what was the ambiguity? The woman in the far corner had set down her reading. She was not pretending she wasn't listening. Sonia Torres was standing very still. Richard looked at the blotter. He looked at Keanu. He looked at Ted. He didn't. He stopped. He started again. He arrived without advance notice to the counter. He arrived at 7:44 for a 7:50 departure, Ted said. 6 minutes early. He identified himself and presented his certificate. He paused. What was the ambiguity, Richard? The terminal was very quiet. The turbine on the apron had cycled down. The refrigerant hum of the beverage station was the only sound. Richard Voss stood at the leather blotter and understood, with a precision that arrived all at once, that the question Ted was asking was not about procedure. It was about the 14 seconds. About what had happened in those 14 seconds before he had looked at the screen. Before he had asked for the certificate. The 14 seconds during which he had decided something based on nothing operational at all. He knew the answer. He did not say it. He opened his mouth. Keanu said, from across the terminal, Richard. Richard looked at him. Keanu was still standing where Ted had met him. Same jacket. Same duffel at his feet. The expression was the same as it had been at the counter. Attentive. Patient. Not going anywhere. I need to pre-flight, Keanu said. Can we do this after? Richard looked at him. He had been given a door. It was not the door he deserved. It was a door offered by someone who had every right to let the room keep going, who could have let Ted's questions run to their natural conclusion in front of the woman in the corner and Sonia and everyone else, who had instead, for a reason Richard could not immediately identify, decided to stop it. Of course, Richard said. Ted looked at Keanu. Something passed between them, a slight nod, a permission. Ted went back to the operations door. Keanu picked up his duffel. He stopped at the counter on his way past. He looked at Richard. 30 minutes after we land, he said. Will you be here? Yes, Richard said. Good. He picked up the pilot certificate from the counter. He put it back in his jacket pocket. He looked at Richard with the same expression. Not unkind, not cold, just present. We'll talk then. He went through the operations door to the apron. Sonia watched the door close. She looked at the certificate's empty spot on the counter. She looked at Richard. Richard was looking at the blotter. The citation departed at 8:03, 13 minutes late, which Ted logged in the operational record with the brief notation, passenger services delay, under review. Richard Voss spent the flight time, 2 hours and 18 minutes to San Jose and back, a location scout turnaround, in the terminal. He did not leave for lunch. He sat at his desk in the small office behind the counter and did the things that needed doing: invoicing, scheduling, a vendor call about the refueling equipment. He did them with his usual precision. He also thought. He thought about the 14 seconds. He thought about the gray jacket and the duffel and the fact that he had not looked at the schedule for 6 hours before the man arrived, and then had not looked at it when the man was standing at his counter. He thought about the word ambiguity, which he had used to Ted, and which had not been the right word. He thought about what the right word would have been, and the right word was worse than ambiguity, and he knew it. He thought about his father in Tucson, about the custom homes, about the way his father had moved through rooms built for other people with the specific care of someone who understood that the rooms were not his, but the work was. He had spent 22 years building a presentation that said, "The room is mine." He had learned the vocabulary and worn the blazer and polished the badge. And this morning, in 14 seconds, the thing he had been defending against, the thing his father had navigated with dignity for 30 years, had come out of his own hands and landed on a man who had done nothing to deserve it, except arrive without announcing himself. He knew what he had done. He had known it when Ted said what was the ambiguity, and he had not said the right word then, and he would need to say the right word now. The citation landed at 2:27. The aircraft was on the apron by 2:39. Keanu came through the operations door at 2:44. He had the duffel, the same jacket. He went to the refreshment station and poured a coffee. He brought a second cup to the counter. "Sit down," he said to Richard. Richard sat. Keanu put the second coffee on the blotter and sat on the client's side of the counter, which was not the usual arrangement, and which meant they were at the same level rather than the counter between them. "Tell me what happened at 7:44, Keanu said. Richard held his coffee cup. He looked at it. "I looked at you and made a decision," he said. "Before I looked at anything else." "What kind of decision?" "About whether you were likely to be who you said you were." He paused. Based on what?" Richard set the cup down. "The jacket," he said. "The bag. The fact that you didn't." He stopped. "The fact that you didn't come in the way I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who?" He stopped again. "Someone who looked like they belonged on a private aircraft." Keanu looked at him. "What does that look like?" he said. He said it without mockery. Genuinely, Richard was quiet. "I don't know how to answer that," he said. And then, after a moment, "That's the problem." The terminal was quiet. Sonia was at the counter, doing something at the keyboard, not looking at them. The woman from the morning had gone. A new client was due at 4. "My father built houses," Keanu said. "His whole working life. He was good at it. He walked through those houses while they were being built, and after they were finished, and not one of them had his name on it anywhere. He looked at the apron through the glass. He was always the man who was going somewhere to do the work, not the man arriving somewhere he owned." He paused. He wore whatever he worked in, because that's what made sense for the job. Richard said nothing. "That's the frame I bring to most situations," Keanu said. "I wear what makes sense. I carry what I need. I don't walk in looking like I own the room, because I never know, in advance, whether the room is the point." He looked at Richard. "The work is usually the point." Richard looked at the leather blotter, the badge, the blazer. He looked at them. "There's a young man," Keanu said. "His name is Marcus. He used to come to this terminal with a private client, an architect who flies out of here twice a month. Marcus is the client's driver. He sits in the car usually while the client goes through." He paused. "Has he ever come inside?" Richard thought. "Once," he said. "He needed to use the restroom. How did you treat him?" Richard was very still. The once was clear in his memory. The careful walk to the counter. The slightly over-explained request. The way Richard had looked at him, the same look, the same 14 seconds, the same decision arrived at before anything was checked. "I sent him to the crew restroom," Richard said quietly, "not the client lounge." "Why?" Richard closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a moment. "Because I decided," he said. "Before I asked anything." "Yes," Keanu said. He let it sit. I'm not here to end your career, Keanu said. You've been here 4 years. Ted respects you. The operation runs well. What you bring to this job is real. He looked at him directly. But you have been making a decision on a timer that is too short. Before you have any information. Before you have looked at the screen or read the certificate or asked the question. He paused. That decision has a pattern, and the pattern has a direction, and you already know which direction it goes. Richard opened his eyes. Yes, he said. What do you want to do about it? The question sat between them. It was not rhetorical. It was not a prompt for an apology. It was a genuine question, the kind that expects an actual answer from a person who has enough respect being extended to them to give one. Richard looked at the blotter. He looked at the badge. He looked at Keanu. I want to call Marcus, he said. And I want to change the timer. Sonia Torres had been processing a booking at the counter and had heard most of the conversation. Not all of it. She had not been trying to hear it. But the terminal was quiet, and the counter was 4 feet from the client chairs, and the conversation had not been conducted in whispers. She had heard, I looked at you and made a decision. Before I looked at anything else, she had heard, I sent him to the crew restroom, not the client lounge. She had heard, what do you want to do about it? She had not heard the answer. That part had been quiet enough. But she had seen Richard's face in the moment before he answered. She had been watching it from the corner of her eye in the way you watch something when you know what you are watching is going to matter. His face had done something she had not seen it do in 14 months of working beside him. It had stopped performing, not collapsed, not broken down, just stopped, the way a piece of music stops performing and starts being played. She had looked away before he spoke. It felt like the right thing. Keanu brought both coffee cups to the refreshment station when the conversation was finished. He rinsed them. He dried them and put them back. He picked up his duffel. He stopped at the counter. Sonia, he said. She looked up. You've been here 14 months? 15, she said, as of last week. You noticed the certificate. It was not a question. Yes, she said. He looked at her. The same expression, the one that was not performing anything, just looking. What did you do with what you noticed? She thought about it. Nothing, she said. I was deciding whether to say something when you stepped aside. She paused. By the time I decided to say something, the situation had changed. What would you have said? She looked at the counter. I would have told him to look at the log, she said, before he did anything else. That's the right answer, Keanu said. He looked at her steadily. The next time you are deciding whether to say something, say it sooner. She looked at him. Even if it's awkward. Especially then, he said. He picked up the duffel by the handle. He nodded at Richard, who was at his desk, on the phone, his voice too quiet to hear from the counter. He pushed through the glass door and walked to the dark green pickup truck. The truck pulled out of the Ave Center lot at 2:58. Sonia stood at the counter. She thought about the 14 seconds, about the timer Richard had named, about all the decisions that happened in that much time, or less, based on the things that should have been checked and weren't. She thought about the crew restroom. She looked at the client lounge. She thought about a lot of things, standing at the counter of a private aviation terminal in Van Nuys at 2:58 in the afternoon, with the apron visible through the glass and the turbines doing their distant business, and the specific quiet of a place where the work had been done, and the aircraft was back, and everything was technically in order. Not everything, though. Not yet. Richard Voss called Marcus that evening. Marcus Okafor was 24 years old and drove for the architect 3 days a week. He had been coming to the AV Center terminal for 8 months. He had used the crew restroom once because the client lounge restroom had a sign that said clients and pre-cleared guests only, and he had not been sure whether he qualified and had not wanted to find out the wrong way. The call was 7 minutes. Richard said what he had done, specifically, in the way that specific apologies work, naming the thing and not softening it with context. He said it had been wrong. He said he understood if Marcus did not want to hear it or respond to it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I genuinely do." He did not say, "It's fine, forget it, don't worry about it." He said, "I appreciate that." And Richard, who had spent 22 years building a fluency in the language of professional interactions, heard the distinction. He sat with it. He changed the sign on the client lounge restroom. Not dramatically. He replaced the laminated card with a new one, printed at the front desk. Restroom, all visitors welcome. He did it on a Thursday morning before anyone else arrived. He did not announce it or explain it. He just replaced the sign and put the old one in the recycling. Sonia noticed it on Thursday afternoon. She did not say anything to Richard. She went to the refreshment station and poured 2 coffees and brought one to his desk. "Thank you," he said. "The sign," she said. He looked at it from his desk. The client lounge visible through the interior window, the new card on the restroom door. "Yes," he said. That was all. Over the following months, Richard Voss changed the timer. It did not change overnight. These things do not change overnight. But it changed in the way that deliberate things change when a person has decided to pay attention. He started with the screen. Before any interaction, before any assessment, the screen first. The name, the booking, the aircraft, the operational status. Information before interpretation. It was a simple rule. It was harder than it sounded, because the timer, the 14 seconds, was fast, and the decision it produced was comfortable in the way that comfortable decisions are comfortable. They required nothing to be revised. Revising required him to sit with the discomfort of having almost always been wrong about the things the timer had decided. He sat with it. Ted Nakamura noticed the change across several months and noted it in Richard's annual review in a line that was brief and accurate. Client interaction significantly improved. Judgment calls more consistently supported by documentation. It was not the most eloquent sentence Ted had ever written. It was exactly what had changed. Sonia Torres left the AV Center terminal 2 years later. She went to Aviation Operations Management, a program at a community college in Northridge that she had been thinking about for a year before she applied. She had been good at the counter job in ways that she had eventually understood were pointing somewhere. In her first semester, there was a class on decision-making in high-pressure environments. The instructor asked the students to describe a decision point they had encountered in a previous job. A moment where something had to be decided quickly, and the outcome had consequences. Sonia had described a terminal at 7:49 in the morning, a certificate on a counter. A departure at 7:50. The question of whether to say something and the moment she had been deciding, and the situation had already moved. The instructor had asked what she had taken from it. "Say it sooner," Sonia said. "Especially when it's awkward. Especially then." The instructor had written it on the board. It stayed there for the rest of the semester. Sonia had not told the class whose certificate it was. That part felt private. It belonged to a 7:44 in the morning in Van Nuys, to a man in a gray jacket who had sat down in a cream leather chair and waited for a process he knew was wrong to run its course, and had offered a door to a man who had not earned one. She had thought about that door more than anything else. about what it costs to offer it, about what it says about the person who does. The thing I keep coming back to is the door, not the certificate, not the 31 minutes, not even the conversation at the counter with the 2 coffees, though that is worth sitting with at length. The door. At 7:52, when Ted came through the operations door and started asking the right questions, the room had a direction it was heading. Richard was going to have to stand there and receive the end of those questions in front of Sonia and the woman in the corner and whoever else happened to be in a private aviation terminal in Van Nuys on a Tuesday morning. And Keanu stopped it. He said, "I need to pre-flight. Can we do this after?" He gave Richard a door. I have been trying to understand why, not the kindness of it. I understand the kindness. What I am trying to understand is the calculation. Because there was a calculation, even if it happened in a second and felt like instinct. The calculation was, what does this moment require? Not what does this moment deserve? What does it require? And the answer was not. Let the room keep going. The answer was, give this man a chance to find out who he wants to be when the room isn't watching. That is a very specific thing to give someone. It is not forgiveness. It is not absolution. It is not the pretense that nothing happened. It is the choice to move the accounting to a private room where the person who did the wrong thing has to face it without an audience, without the armor of public defensiveness, without the ability to perform contrition instead of meaning it. Richard Voss went to that room. He said the right word, not the word he had used to Ted, ambiguity, but the word underneath it, the word that named what the timer was actually measuring. He said it to a man who had been made to wait in his own terminal, and he said it without softening it, and that is harder than it sounds. I do not know if I would have offered the door. I want to think I would. I want to think that if someone had made me wait in my own terminal, on a calendar I had logged and a certificate I had earned, I would have been composed enough to say, "Can we do this after?" I am not confident. What I am confident about is Sonia Torres at the counter with the certificate in her hand at 7:49. The moment she was deciding. The way she described it, by the time I decided to say something, the situation had changed. A minute, maybe less. The difference between the moment and the moment after it. She changed her timer too. Not 14 seconds. A different timer. The one that measures how long it takes to decide that the awkward thing is worth saying. She moved that line forward. She built a career partly on the principle of saying it sooner. One conversation in a private terminal in Van Nuys at 2:40-something in the afternoon. That is what it took. That, and a man in a gray jacket who needed some air and offered a door he was not required to offer. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves's well-known quality of composure. The specific composure of a man who knows who he is, has no need to announce it, and tends to be most gracious at the exact moments when graciousness is least required of him. If something in it stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me about the door you were given, or the door you gave, or the door you wish you had offered when the room was still going. If you know someone who is holding something like what Richard was holding, a decision made too fast, a timer set too short, share this with them. Not as a lesson, as a story. Subscribe. We are not. See you in the next one.